Picture this. You're a young woman in Victorian London, and you're slowly dying from the inside out. Your jaw is rotting away, your teeth are falling out, and your bones are literally glowing in the dark. But here's the twisted part. You're one of the lucky ones, because at least you have a job. What I'm about to reveal will shock you about the lives of women who worked in Victorian factories. These weren't just tough jobs, they were death traps disguised as employment. And the women trapped inside had stories that would make your blood run cold.
You think modern work is hard? Wait until you hear about the match girls who literally sacrificed their faces to make a living, or the textile workers who were assaulted by their bosses and couldn't speak up without losing everything. This isn't just history, it's a horror story that actually happened to millions of women. But before we dive into the absolute nightmare that was Victorian factory life, let me paint you a picture of what London looked like in 1888. Imagine a city where the air was so thick with coal smoke that you couldn't see the sun most days. The Thames was basically an open sewer, flowing with industrial waste and human excrement. The smell alone would knock you unconscious if you weren't used to it.
In this toxic wasteland, over 4 million people were crammed into spaces meant for maybe half that number. The wealthy lived in grand houses in places like Mayfair and Belgravia, while the poor were packed into slums so overcrowded that entire families shared single rooms with no running water, no toilets, and no hope of escape. The Industrial Revolution had promised progress, prosperity, and a better life for everyone. Instead, it created a two-tiered society where a small elite lived in unimaginable luxury, while the masses struggled to survive in conditions that were often worse than medieval times. And at the very bottom of this hierarchy were working-class women, treated as expendable resources to be used up and discarded.
The year is 1888, and you're standing outside a factory in London's East End. The smell hits you first. A cocktail of chemicals, sweat, and something else you can't identify. It's the smell of desperation. The building looms over you, windowless walls trapping whatever happens inside. You're about to enter what social reformers called a sweating industry, but that sanitized term doesn't capture the brutal reality of what went on behind those walls. These factories were deliberately designed as instruments of torture disguised as places of employment. The owners had studied every possible way to extract maximum profit from human misery, and they'd perfected it into a science. Let me take you through what a typical factory looked like from the inside. First, forget everything you know about workplace safety or human dignity. These buildings were constructed with one purpose: to squeeze every possible penny from human suffering. The moment you stepped inside, the heat would hit you like a physical wall. Factories were deliberately kept at temperatures that would make a sauna seem cool. Why? Because heat made certain manufacturing processes faster, and faster meant more profit. The fact that workers regularly collapsed from heat exhaustion was just the cost of doing business. The air was thick with toxic particles, cotton fibers that would eventually destroy your lungs, chemical fumes that burned your throat and eyes, and the sweet stench of human sweat mixed with industrial waste. Ventilation was deliberately poor because windows were seen as distractions and sources of lost productivity. The machinery was designed to be as dangerous as possible,
while still technically functional. Safety guards were removed because they slowed down production. Warning signs were not existent because workers who got hurt could be easily replaced. The noise was so loud that many workers suffered permanent hearing damage within their first year.
Women and girls, some as young as 13, worked 14-hour shifts in rooms so cramped they could barely move. But it gets worse, much worse. The lighting was deliberately inadequate, forcing workers to strain their eyes constantly. This wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was a calculated decision. Proper lighting cost money, and injured workers could be replaced cheaper than installing better lamps.
The floors were kept wet and slippery, supposedly for cleaning purposes, but really because it made workers move more carefully and therefore work longer hours. Slipping and falling meant lost wages, so women learned to move like they were walking on ice, every step calculated and cautious. The most horrifying example was the matchmaking industry, specifically the Bryant and May factory in Bow. This place wasn't just a workplace, it was a systematic method for slowly murdering women while extracting profit from their death throes. These women worked with white phosphorus, a chemical so toxic it was banned for military use because it was considered too inhumane for warfare. Let that sink in for a moment. This chemical was too cruel to use against enemy soldiers, but perfectly acceptable to expose to British working women every day. White phosphorus is a hellish substance. It ignites spontaneously in air, burns at over 800 degrees Celsius, and continues burning even underwater. When it gets on human skin, it burns through to the bone. But that's just the immediate danger. The long-term effects were far worse. The phosphorus would seep into their jawbones through tiny cuts in their mouths, causing a condition called phossy jaw. And this wasn't just a medical term. It was a slow, agonizing death sentence that played out over months or years. Would begin to loosen and fall out, not cleanly, but in bloody, infected chunks. The smell was indescribable, like rotting meat mixed with sulfur. As the phosphorus ate away at your jawbone, your face would begin to collapse inward. Your cheeks would cave in, your lips would peel back in a permanent grimace, and your speech would become slurred and barely understandable.
But here's the part that will haunt your dreams. The phosphorus made their bones glow in the dark. These women would go home at night, look in their mirrors, and see their own skeletons glowing green through their rotting flesh, like some nightmare vision from hell. Imagine trying to sleep when your own face is glowing in the darkness, reminding you constantly of the poison eating you alive from the inside. Imagine trying to eat when every bite sends shooting pains through your dissolving jaw. Imagine trying to kiss your children goodnight when your breath smells like death and your face looks like a living corpse.
And the factory owners, they knew exactly what was happening. They'd seen hundreds of women go through this same horrific process. They had medical reports documenting every stage of the disease. They knew that switching to safer alternatives would prevent it entirely. But they kept using white phosphorus anyway because it was cheaper and more profitable. They calculated that the cost of occasionally replacing dead workers was less than the expense of using safer materials.
In other countries, Bryant and May had already switched to red phosphorus, a safer alternative that worked just as well. Their German and French factories were producing matches without slowly murdering their workers. But in Britain, where desperate women would work for pennies and die for profits, they stuck with the deadly white phosphorus.
This wasn't ignorance or an unfortunate accident. It was premeditated, systematic murder for profit. Every executive who signed off on continuing to use white phosphorus was knowingly condemning women to horrific deaths. The women didn't choose these jobs because they wanted to. They chose them because the alternative was starvation, and sometimes a quick death seemed preferable to a slow one. Let me tell you about Sarah, a typical woman who found herself trapped in this system. She'd started as a seamstress, which sounds respectable until you understand what that actually meant.
As a seamstress, Sarah worked 16-hour days in a freezing cold room, straining her eyes by candlelight to make tiny, perfect stitches. Her fingers would crack and bleed in winter, leaving blood stains on the expensive fabric she sewed. The pay was 8 pence for a full day's work, barely enough to rent a corner of a shared room and buy a single meal. She was slowly going blind from the eye strain, slowly developing tuberculosis from the cold and malnutrition, and slowly watching her hands become twisted and arthritic from the repetitive motions. It was a death sentence, just stretched out over years instead of months. When her friend Jane showed up one day wearing a clean wool dress and carrying hot food, Sarah knew something had changed. Jane had found work at a factory, and despite the obvious dangers, she looked healthier than she had in years.
2.5 shillings a week, Jane told her. Real food every day and a roof that doesn't leak. She paused, then added quietly, "Of course, there's the other things, the chemicals, the accidents, the bosses who get handsy. But Mary, I was dying anyway as a seamstress. At least this way, it might be quick." This was the choice faced by millions of British women. Slow starvation as a seamstress or quick death in a factory. Most chose the factory, not because it was good, but because it was slightly less terrible than the alternatives. But even that understates how limited their options were. Let's talk about what else was available to working class women in Victorian Britain. Domestic service was one option, but it meant working 18-hour days, 7 days a week, for room and board, plus maybe £10 a year. You'd be sexually assaulted by the master of the house, beaten by the mistress for minor infractions, and dismissed without references if you got pregnant or complained about mistreatment.
Prostitution was always available, but it meant a life expectancy of about 4 years due to violence, disease, and drug addiction. The lucky ones died young. The unlucky ones survived to experience the full horror of what Victorian society did to fallen women. Agricultural work paid even less than sewing and was only available seasonally. Laundry work destroyed your hands with harsh chemicals and scalding water. Taking in lodgers meant cramming even more people into already overcrowded spaces and dealing with all the problems that brought. Factory work, despite its horrors, offered something these other options didn't: steady pay that was actually enough to live on, if barely. That's why women kept coming, even knowing what would happen to them.
Inside these industrial hellholes, women faced horrors that went far beyond dangerous chemicals. The factories were deliberately designed to maximize suffering while maintaining just enough functionality to keep producing goods.
Let me walk you through a typical day in one of these places, using a textile factory as an example. You'd arrive at 5:30 a.m. because being even 1 minute late meant a fine that could eat up hours of wages. The supervisors would be waiting at the doors with pocket watches, timing each worker's arrival with sadistic precision. The moment you stepped inside, the noise would assault you like a physical blow. Hundreds of power looms running simultaneously created a sound so loud that many workers went partially or completely deaf within their first year. Communication was impossible except through hand signals, isolating each woman in her own private hell despite being surrounded by hundreds of others.
The air was thick with cotton fibers that would eventually destroy your lungs, causing a condition called mill lung that made breathing increasingly difficult until you basically suffocated from the inside. The humidity was kept artificially high because it made the cotton easier to work with, but it also made the already stifling heat unbearable. The machinery was deliberately designed to be as dangerous as possible while still technically functional. Safety guards were removed because they slowed production by seconds, and those seconds translated to lost profit. Moving parts were left exposed, meaning that getting your hair or clothing caught could result in being pulled into the machinery and killed instantly.
But the owners had calculated that occasional workplace deaths were cheaper than safety equipment. They could replace a dead worker for free, but safety guards cost money up front. The work itself was mind-numbingly repetitive and physically demanding. You'd stand in the same position for 14 hours, performing the same motions thousands of times, while breathing toxic air and dodging dangerous machinery. Your feet would swell until your shoes felt like torture devices. Your back would ache until standing upright became agony.
But perhaps the most insidious part of the system was how the owners had turned exploitation into a precise science through their fine system. This wasn't just about docking pay for major infractions, it was about creating arbitrary penalties that could drain away a worker's entire wage. You could be fined for talking, for not talking when spoken to, for working too slowly, for working too quickly and making other workers look bad, for having dirty hands, for having suspiciously clean hands that suggested you'd been slacking, for coughing, for not coughing when you were obviously sick, for looking tired, for looking too energetic, for absolutely anything the supervisors could dream up.
The genius of this system was that it was impossible to avoid fines entirely. No matter how carefully you followed the rules, there was always something you could be penalized for. This kept workers in a constant state of anxiety and debt, making them easier to control. Some women found that after a full week of 14-hour days, their entire wages had been consumed by fines. They'd worked 98 hours and come home with nothing, sometimes even owing money to the factory for various infractions. The toilet breaks were strictly limited and timed with military precision. You got 5 minutes, twice per shift, and if you took longer due to illness or menstruation, you'd be fined for lost productivity. Many women developed serious urinary and digestive problems from holding it for hours at a time.
Water breaks were similarly controlled. You could drink from the communal bucket once per hour, but only during designated times. The water was often contaminated with industrial chemicals that had leaked from nearby processes, causing stomach problems
And worse, if you got sick from the working conditions, and you would get sick, you'd be fined for missing work. There was no concept of sick leave or workers' compensation. If the factory's chemicals gave you chronic breathing problems, that was your fault for being weak. If the machinery injured you, you should have been more careful. The factory owners justified this system by claiming they were providing opportunities for women, lifting them out of poverty and giving them purpose. They painted themselves as benevolent saviors, while literally poisoning their workers for profit. But the real evil of the system was how it trapped women in cycles of dependency. The wages were just enough to survive on if you worked constantly and avoided all fines. This meant you could never save money to leave, never take time off to look for better work, never improve your situation. You were trapped in a system designed to consume your life force gradually while extracting maximum profit from your slow destruction. And the owners made sure you knew it. The message was clear that you were expendable, replaceable, and lucky to have even this opportunity to suffer for their benefit.
The Bryant and May Match Factory became the symbol of everything wrong with Victorian industry, but it was far from unique. By 1888, it employed over 1,400 women and girls, making it one of the largest employers of female labor in London. But size didn't mean better conditions. It meant industrial-scale human suffering. The company had perfected the art of extracting maximum profit from human misery. They'd studied every aspect of their workers' lives to find new ways to exploit them. And they'd created a system so efficient at causing suffering that other industries copied their methods. Let me break down exactly how this worked, because the details matter. Understanding the systematic nature of this cruelty is essential to grasping how such horrors could continue for decades. The match workers were forced to meet impossibly high quotas, working exceptionally long hours for a pittance of a wage.
Bryant and May divided their workers into rigid categories with different pay scales, playing groups against each other to prevent solidarity. The youngest girls, some as young as 13, were paid the least and given the most dangerous jobs. They reasoned that children's smaller hands were better suited for detailed work, conveniently ignoring the fact that those same small hands were more easily damaged by the chemicals. The company paid piece rates rather than hourly wages, meaning workers were paid based on how much they produced rather than how long they worked. This sounds fair until you realize it was designed to pit workers against each other and encourage them to ignore safety in pursuit of higher pay. If you worked slowly to avoid injury, you'd earn less than subsistence wages. If you worked quickly to earn living wages, you'd almost certainly be hurt by the dangerous conditions. Either way, the company won. They got maximum production at minimum cost while transferring all the risk to their workers. The piece rate system also allowed them to reduce payments arbitrarily. If they decided your work wasn't quite good enough, they could reject entire batches and pay you nothing for hours of labor. There was no appeal process and no objective standards. Supervisors could destroy your income on a whim.
Bryant and May also pioneered the use of company stores, forcing workers to buy their food and supplies from company-owned shops at inflated prices. This meant that even the meager wages they paid often flowed right back into company coffers. Workers would get paid on Friday, spend it all at the company store for basic necessities, and start the next week already in debt. The company housing was another trap. Workers could rent rooms in company-owned buildings, which sounds convenient until you realize it gave the company complete control over their workers' private lives. Step out of line at work, and you'd find yourself homeless as well as unemployed.
Company management boasted about their charitable donations and community involvement while systematically murdering their workers. They saw no contradiction in funding hospitals while creating the injuries that filled them, or supporting orphanages while creating the orphans through workplace deaths.
The really twisted part was how they used religion to justify their brutality. Company literature frequently mentioned their Christian values and moral responsibility to provide employment for the deserving poor. They framed workplace suffering as character building, suggesting that women who couldn't handle the conditions were morally weak rather than physically poisoned. Meanwhile, the Bryant family lived in mansions, traveled extensively, and sent their children to the finest schools. They genuinely believed they were superior human beings who deserved luxury, while their workers deserved suffering. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was a complete worldview that divided humanity into different species with different rights and values. But Bryant and May had one massive vulnerability they didn't recognize. They'd created conditions so horrific that eventually even the most desperate workers would reach their breaking point.
What the history books often skip over entirely is the endemic sexual violence that was built into the factory system. This wasn't an unfortunate side effect of industrialization. It was a deliberate feature that served multiple purposes for the owners and managers. Male supervisors held absolute power over desperate women who had no other options for survival. This created perfect conditions for systematic sexual abuse, and the factory owners knew it. They could have implemented protections, oversight, or accountability measures, but they didn't because sexual violence served their interests. First, it was another form of unpaid labor. Women who were sexually abused were providing an additional service to male employees without any compensation. This increased the value the company got from its workforce while keeping labor costs low. Second, sexual violence was a control mechanism. Women who were being abused were less likely to organize, complain, or fight back in other ways. The shame, trauma, and isolation that came with sexual violence made workers more compliant and easier to exploit in every other aspect. Third, it created a hierarchy of abuse that divided workers against each other. Women who submitted to sexual demands might receive slightly better treatment, while those who resisted faced even worse conditions. This prevented solidarity and made collective action more difficult.
The Victorian legal system offered no protection whatsoever. Sexual harassment wasn't even recognized as a concept. It was just considered part of a woman's natural role to endure male attention. The law assumed that men had a right to access women's bodies, especially working-class women, who were seen as inherently immoral. If a woman complained about sexual abuse, she faced a system designed to blame and punish her rather than her abuser. She would be accused of encouraging the behavior through her appearance, manner, or mere presence in the workplace. Courts operated on the assumption that respectable men wouldn't lie about such things, while working-class women were inherently untrustworthy. Male supervisors knew they were completely untouchable. They could assault, rape, and terrorize their female workers with absolute impunity, secure in the knowledge that these women had no recourse and nowhere else to turn. Speaking up meant losing their jobs, and losing their jobs meant starvation or prostitution. This created horrific cycles of abuse, where the most vulnerable women became targets for the worst treatment. Single mothers, women with disabilities,
older women who couldn't find work elsewhere, and young girls with no family protection were systematically exploited by men who knew they could act with complete immunity.
The psychological impact was devastating. Women who were already dealing with chemical poisoning, physical exhaustion, and economic desperation now had to navigate constant sexual violence as well. Many developed what we would now recognize as severe trauma symptoms, but Victorian society had no understanding of psychological injury. Instead, women who showed signs of trauma were labeled as hysterical, unstable, or morally deficient. This provided another excuse to abuse them further, creating spirals of violence that often ended in suicide or complete mental breakdown.
But perhaps most enraging of all was how the factory owners used sexual violence as a recruitment tool. They deliberately spread word that certain supervisors were friendly to attractive young women, using the promise of protection from the worst abuses to lure in new workers. These women would discover too late that the protection came with a price: sexual submission to their protectors. Once trapped in these arrangements, they found it almost impossible to escape. Refusing meant facing not just economic ruin, but retaliation from spurned abusers who had the power to make their lives even more hellish. The system was designed to break women's spirits completely, to reduce them to mere production units who would accept any treatment as long as they were allowed to survive another day. And for decades, it worked exactly as intended. But systems built on such extreme oppression contain the seeds of their own destruction. The more brutally you treat people, the more explosive their eventual resistance becomes. And by 1888, decades of accumulated suffering were about to detonate.
July 1888, the month that changed everything, though it started with what seemed like a minor incident. 3 Bryant and May workers approached Annie Besant, a social reformer who published a newspaper called The Link. They'd reached the point where they literally had nothing left to lose. These 3 women, whose names history has mostly forgotten, which is itself a tragedy, had watched too many of their friends die from phossy jaw. They'd endured too many sexual assaults, too many arbitrary fines, too many 14-hour shifts breathing poison for starvation wages.
Annie Besant was a remarkable woman who deserves more recognition than she gets. She was a socialist, a feminist, and a brilliant writer who understood that social change required not just good intentions, but strategic action. When these 3 factory workers told her their stories, she knew she had a weapon that could bring down the entire system. But Besant was smart enough to know that emotional appeals alone wouldn't work. She needed facts, figures, and documentation that would be impossible for the company to deny or dismiss. So she launched what was essentially an undercover investigation, gathering evidence about working conditions that would shock even Victorian society.
What she discovered was worse than anything she'd imagined. The 3 women had actually understated the horrors of factory life, either because they'd become so normalized to abuse that they didn't recognize its extremity, or because they were afraid that the full truth would be too unbelievable to accept. Besant spent weeks documenting every aspect of the Bryant and May operation. She got detailed medical reports about phossy jaw, financial records showing the disparity between worker wages and company profits, testimonies from dozens of current and former workers, and evidence of the systematic sexual abuse that pervaded the factory.
On June 23, 1888, Besant published an article titled "White Slavery in London" that would become one of the most important pieces of investigative journalism in British history. The title itself was calculated to outrage Victorian sensibilities by comparing the treatment of white British women to
to the chattel slavery that the empire had recently abolished. The article was devastating in its precision and scope. Besant didn't just describe the horrible conditions. She named specific executives, provided exact wage figures, quoted company policies that revealed the systematic nature of the abuse, and documented how the owner's wealth was directly built on worker suffering.
She described the Fosse jaw in clinical detail that made it impossible for readers to dismiss as exaggeration. She provided financial calculations showing that workers were essentially paying for the privilege of being slowly murdered. She documented the fine system that trapped women in permanent debt to their employers. Most importantly, she made it clear that these weren't accidents or unfortunate side effects of industrialization. They were deliberate policy decisions made by specific individuals who could be held accountable.
The public response was immediate and electric. Victorian society, for all its flaws and hypocrisies, was genuinely shocked by the revelations. Middle-class readers who had never thought much about where their matches came from were horrified to learn about the human cost of this everyday convenience. Letters poured in to newspapers supporting the match girls. Donations began arriving for strike funds that didn't even exist yet. Politicians who had ignored industrial conditions for decades suddenly found themselves under pressure to take action. But the factory owners' response was swift and brutal. They knew exactly who that talked to Besant. The factory's spy network was sophisticated and efficient. Within days, the 3 women who had provided information were fired, blacklisted, and thrown out of company housing.
Bryant and May thought this would end the matter. They'd identified and eliminated the troublemakers, sent a clear message about what happened to whistleblowers, and expected the other workers to cower back into submission. They were catastrophically wrong. Instead of being intimidated, something unprecedented happened. When word spread through the factory about the dismissals, the women's response wasn't fear, it was rage. Decades of accumulated suffering suddenly found a focus, and that focus was revolutionary. On July 5th, 1888, at exactly 7:30 a.m., something happened that wasn't supposed to be possible. 200 women walked out of the Bryant and May factory. Not a few troublemakers or radical agitators, ordinary working women who had been treated as expendable, decided they'd had enough.
By noon, the number had grown to 600. By evening, over 1,000. Within 3 days, 1,400 women had joined what would become known as the London Match Girls' Strike, and the entire operation ground to a complete halt. This wasn't supposed to happen. Working-class women weren't supposed to organize. They weren't supposed to understand their own power or have the courage to use it. They were supposed to accept whatever was done to them and be grateful for the opportunity to slowly die for their employer's profit. The strike organizers had no experience with labor organizing, no union backing, no political connections, and no financial resources. What they had was something more powerful. They had reached the absolute limit of human endurance, and they were no longer afraid of the consequences of fighting back.
The women who emerged as leaders during the strike were extraordinary individuals whose names should be remembered alongside the great revolutionaries of history. Sarah Chapman, a teenage worker who became one of the main spokespeople, displayed a political sophistication and rhetorical skill that impressed even hostile observers.
Mary Driscoll, one of the women whose faces had been partially destroyed by Fosse jaw, became a powerful symbol of what the company had done to its workers. Her appearance shocked middle-class observers
and made the abstract horror of phosphorus poisoning into a visceral, undeniable reality. These women and dozens of others transformed themselves from victims into leaders, from isolated individuals into a collective force that would change British history. They proved that ordinary people faced with extraordinary oppression were capable of extraordinary resistance. The strike wasn't just about wages or working conditions, it was about fundamental human dignity. These women were declaring that they were worth more than slow death in service of corporate profits. They were demanding to be treated as human beings rather than expendable machinery.
But perhaps most importantly, they were demonstrating that the system's power depended entirely on their cooperation. The moment they withdrew that cooperation, the entire operation collapsed. The factory owners, who had seemed so powerful, were revealed to be completely dependent on the women they'd been abusing. The strikers' demands were remarkably sophisticated for people who supposedly lacked education or political understanding. They didn't just ask for higher wages. They demanded an end to the fine system, safer working conditions, reasonable hours, protection from sexual harassment, and recognition of their right to organize. They also demanded something that terrified the owners even more than financial concessions. They wanted dignity. They wanted to be treated with basic human respect, to have their concerns taken seriously, to be acknowledged as people with rights rather than property to be used and discarded.
The company's initial response revealed just how disconnected the owners were from reality. They assumed the strike would collapse within days once the women realized they had no income. They had no understanding of how desperate their workers had become, or how much support the strike would attract from outside. Bryant and May executives issued statements calling the strikers ungrateful, claiming they provided excellent working conditions and fair wages. They seemed genuinely baffled that women would complain about jobs that, from the owner's perspective, were generous opportunities offered to the undeserving poor. They hired strike breakers, trying to replace the striking women with desperate workers from other parts of London. But the strikers had prepared for this. They organized around-the-clock picketing that made it almost impossible for scabs to get through. More importantly, they launched a publicity campaign that made strike breaking socially unacceptable.
The owners tried to use their political connections to get police intervention, but the public support for the strikers made this politically impossible. Politicians who tried to help the company found themselves facing angry constituents who demanded justice for the match girls. Most desperately, the company tried to wait out the strike, assuming that starvation would force the women back to work on any terms. They had no understanding of how the strike had tapped into something larger than individual economic desperation. What the owners failed to grasp was that the strike had given these women something they'd never had before: hope. For the first time in their lives, they weren't just surviving from day to day, they were fighting for a better future, and that fight had transformed them.
The strike also revealed the power of media in shaping public opinion. Annie Besant's ongoing coverage in The Link kept the strike in the public eye. But other newspapers also began covering the story as it became clear this was a major social event. For the first time, working-class women were being interviewed, quoted, and treated as individuals with their own voices, rather than nameless representatives of a social problem. The newspapers published their stories, their demands, and their own words about what they'd endured. This media attention served multiple purposes. It educated middle-class readers about conditions they'd never imagined. It put pressure on politicians to take action. It attracted donations and support that kept the strike going. And most importantly,
It showed the striking women that their society was capable of seeing them as human beings worthy of concern.
The donations that poured in were particularly significant because they demonstrated concrete solidarity from people who had no direct connection to the strike. Shop girls contributed their lunch money. Middle-class women organized fundraising teas. Even some wealthy individuals sent substantial sums to support the strike fund. This financial support was crucial for practical reasons. It allowed the strikers to survive without wages for weeks. But it was even more important psychologically, proving to the women that they weren't alone in their fight. The strike also inspired copycat actions in other industries. Women working in similar conditions saw that resistance was possible and began organizing their own protests. The match girls had opened a door that could never be fully closed again.
Support came from unexpected quarters as well. Some Christian organizations, initially hostile to the strike as a challenge to natural social order, began to see it as a moral crusade against industrial sin. Trade unions that had previously ignored women workers suddenly discovered an interest in organizing them. Political organizations across the spectrum found ways to support the strike while advancing their own agendas. Socialists saw it as proof that workers could organize themselves. Liberals viewed it as evidence that reform was needed to prevent revolution. Even some conservatives supported it as a way to attack industrial excess while preserving traditional social values. But the most powerful support came from other working-class women who recognized their own struggles in the match girls' stories. Seamstresses, laundresses, domestic servants, and factory workers from other industries saw that if the match girls could win, maybe they could improve their own conditions too.
As the strike entered its second week, it became clear that this was no longer just a labor dispute. It was a social movement that was reshaping how British society thought about work, workers, and women's rights. The Bryant and May executives were facing pressure from multiple directions. Their stockholders were demanding a quick resolution that would restore profitability. Their political allies were urging compromise to avoid further scandal. Their own families were facing social ostracism as the full extent of company practices became public knowledge. But perhaps most importantly, they were discovering that their business model was completely dependent on workers who were no longer willing to be slowly murdered for corporate profit. Without the women's labor, they had no product to sell and no profits to distribute.
The strike was also revealing the interconnected nature of the industrial system. Bryant and May's inability to produce matches was affecting retailers, other manufacturers who used matches in their processes, and even the export trade that brought foreign currency into Britain. For the first time, the true economic value of these supposedly expendable workers was becoming visible. The women who had been treated as easily replaceable were proving to be the foundation upon which the entire operation depended. As pressure mounted from all sides, the company began making tentative offers to end the strike. But the women had learned not to trust their employers' promises, and they demanded concrete, verifiable changes rather than vague commitments to improve conditions.
The negotiations that followed were unlike anything that had happened before in British industrial relations. For the first time, working-class women were sitting across the table from company executives as equals, making demands and refusing to accept inadequate offers.
The women's negotiating skills impressed even hostile observers. They had done their homework, understanding exactly what they needed and why each demand was important. They refused to be divided by offers that benefited some workers but not others. They insisted on written agreements rather than verbal promises. Most importantly, they maintained their solidarity throughout the negotiations. The company tried repeatedly to split the strikers by making special offers to different groups, but the women held together with remarkable discipline. After 3 weeks of strike action that had captured national attention and inspired similar movements across the country, Bryant and May finally capitulated. The agreement they signed was unprecedented in British labor history. It was the first time a major corporation had been forced to negotiate with unorganized women workers as equals. The company agreed to abolish the worst aspects of the fine system, improve safety conditions, provide medical care for workers injured by industrial processes, recognize the women's right to organize and complain without retaliation, and establish a process for addressing future grievances.
Most importantly, they agreed to phase out the use of white phosphorus in favor of safer alternatives, a change that would save thousands of lives over the coming years. But the real victory went far beyond the specific terms of the agreement. The match girls had proven that even the most powerless people could organize successfully if they had the courage to stand together. They had forced British society to confront the reality of industrial working conditions and acknowledged that change was both necessary and possible. The strike's success inspired similar actions across Britain and internationally. Within months, women workers in industries from textiles to food processing were organizing strikes modeled on the match girls' tactics. The idea that working-class women could successfully challenge their employers spread like wildfire. The political impact was equally significant. The strike had demonstrated the power of investigative journalism to expose social problems and mobilize public opinion. It had shown that working-class voices could be heard if they were amplified effectively. It had proven that solidarity between